Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya, finally the reduction in violence, as it's called, agreement coming into force 21st, 22nd, midnight, 7 days, a crucial period. Would you say it's a significant step down a long and arduous road?
Well, firstly, I think it's a new word introduced into the lexicon of, a peace process and ceasefire. In effect, they are salami slicing a ceasefire into smaller bits. But I think any positive movement is to be welcomed. It is in some sense a good faith test of Taliban intention and also their ability capacity and their ability to impose discipline down the line. But I think most of all it reflects the determination and the hurry that the United States is in to sign what they have initialed earlier in Doha and to actually embark on the next phase, which is the intra-Afghan talks, which will actually provide them the opportunity or the window in which to actually consider their troop withdrawal or reduction, depending on what exactly the objective is.
What are we looking at in terms of reduction in violence? There's specifics, the Americans always like to quantify things and measure things.
So what we have so far, of course, I think I've seen the official statements and they don't go into details. But what we learn is that the Taliban have agreed to a kind of a reduction in violence from about 75 per day to about 15 per day, that they will not attack cities, highways, the U.S. bases and the ENDSF bases, which actually means that they are free to attack villages and rural areas, which is strange in some ways. And of course, various other kind of monitoring mechanisms and reporting mechanisms and retaliation mechanisms that in case there's a breach of ceasefire, of course, all sides retain their right to take action. But I think the significant thing is that while on the Afghan side, it virtually means stoppage of all offensive operations, on the Taliban side, it is a reduction of about, let's say, about 75%. In the attacks, and that too in those designated areas.
And you were also mentioning some kind of a joint mechanism to monitor or even communicate with each other. That's the Americans and the Taliban.
So I hear.
Something on the line of Syria.
But it is something like a monitoring mechanism. In other words, if there is a breach, that they would be reported to their negotiators in Taliban, who would then presumably take some action. Exactly the nature of the communication mechanism, I'm not sure if monitoring actually leads to communication, but yeah, there is a kind of reporting mechanism that has been built in.
And you were talking about the hurry that the Americans are in, and that's pretty evident. 14th of February is when we actually first reported these dates, which is 22nd, a week, 29th, when the signing. And now both the Taliban and Secretary Pompeo are also putting out that date is where the planning for the signing of the deal is.
Right. Yeah, clearly, I mean, they want to sign the deal and they want to get the intra-Afghan talks started, because I think until they get the intra-Afghan talks started, the fig leaf that there is an overall package, comprehensive solution will be missing. It'll be interesting to see what exactly they do if and when the intra-Afghan talks get started.
There's been some kind of decoupling of the whole event, the whole process, I beg your pardon. But now, the contours have been drawn out, and they're similar to what happened in September as well. So post this signing, if it happens in front of world representatives, and I'm not sure whether India will actually be one of them in Doha, then it's the intra-Afghan talks, possibly within 10 days, so that we're looking at March, mid-March. The Taliban have been insisting on, there's been another agreement of swapping of prisoners, 5,000 of theirs, 1,000 of the Afghans. The presidential palace is saying no. So there are a lot of things that still need to be sorted out.
Right. So I think I agree with you. There are things. For example, I mean, even on the question of full withdrawal of forces, I mean, the Taliban are still insisting on full withdrawal.
Complete.
Secretary Pompeo's statements did talk about reduction in forces.
And a conditional reduction.
Conditional reduction.
8,600 is what we're hearing, possibly maximum period of 18 months, maybe less.
Right. In the meantime, the window for the withdrawal is, of course, getting shorter and shorter, starting from, let's say September, when it was first initialed. So I think, it's from emphatically repudiating a time-based withdrawal schedule. When President Trump announced his South Asia strategy to a conditions-based strategy, I think now we are back to a time-based strategy with some conditions attached. And those conditions seem to be quite weak, because I think everybody knows that there is a time horizon within which they would like to do that.
One of the conditions is that Afghan soil won't be used against other states. Some kind of delinking from other terrorist groups. Now, in the light of what happened with the New York opinion, with somebody called Sirajuddin Haqqani giving an opinion piece which sounds like a general in GHQ has written it, or maybe a Washington PR person.
Right.
And Sirajuddin and the Haqqani's deep intrinsic roots with the Al-Qaeda.
Right.
How does that fit in with what the Americans want?
Right. So again, I think that's also a very interesting point. I think in that very interesting opinion piece that Sirajuddin, well, was probably drafted for him, as you said, he basically tries to meet the international community on virtually all their concerns. An inclusive political system, women, equal rights for all.
It's still under Islamic law.
It sort of says Islamic system. Where it talks about the political system, does not mention Islamic, and in fact it actually purposefully, I think, omits any reference to an emirate. So I think it goes out of the way to tailor. It was tailor-made for an international audience in order to remove their anxieties about what could happen. And he, of course, goes out of the way to also say that, Afghan territory will not be used. He does not call them terrorist outfits. He calls them disruptive groups. And he also says that it is overstated. It's exaggerated. The threat of such groups is exaggerated. Nevertheless, he says that, we will not allow these. So there are clearly gaps in perception. And I think I'm sure that the idea of the negotiators, at least on the American side, would be to gradually whittle down these gaps and come to some common understanding. But to me, it seems as though clearly the Taliban are holding back on some of the assurances that the US would like to see, in print and very clearly. Though in general terms, they have tried to reassure. And I think it's a PR exercise, as you said, because it's not so much aimed at the negotiators who know exactly what is happening as the American public.
But again, the New York Times opinion piece has got a lot of flack. Maybe they could have, countered each of the points that he had raised in another piece, possibly. Like I'm saying, because of the intricate nature of the Haqqani network and its potency and lethality, which doesn't come out at all.
No, not at all. I mean, there are several issues that have been completely ducked. I mean, Al-Qaeda is completely, missing in that thing. And as I said, a very almost inoffensive terminology of disruptive groups has been introduced. I think commentators and analysts have been very clear that those who take it as it is at face value would be making a big error. There is a big, there's a big trust gap that is still there. But as I said, I think this is really meant to beguile the public, and also the public that may not be that informed, into thinking that they are sincere about peace. And you were right also to pick out that point that there's been widespread kind of reaction, both to the opinion piece in terms of its content, whether it can be trusted or not, but also that the New York Times has allowed itself to be a platform for a PR exercise that almost certainly seems ghostwritten by one of the two entities that you mentioned.
Where does the Afghan government in all this? We know that Zalmai Khalilzad has been meeting various political parties, leaders. He's met President Ashraf Ghani as well.
So again, this is a very interesting question. I think President Ghani and President Ghani's side of the government, as well as I think others, have been kept informed, regularly about the progress, and every now and then they have issued statements that would appear.
So the earlier trust deficit, you think, has come down between Americans and?
I'm not so sure about the language and the feeling. One could be a cover of the other, but certainly the language from the Afghan government side right now is much more friendly, much more cooperative, much more being consulted. At the same time, some people have also raised this question about the timing of the announcement of the results, after 5 months, just as the reduction in violence agreement appeared to be imminent.
So he has all those meetings with Secretary Pompeo, with Khalilzad, with Esper, with Scott Miller in Munich.
Right.
He comes back, and within 2 days, the IC, which has been taking IC and the ICC have been taking months.
Right.
Give it to him.
But let me get to the other point. The point is that on the face of it, it would seem as though an American plan has been upset. That means, things were going smoothly and intra-Afghan talks could begin.
But that's not necessarily so?
But that's not necessarily, no, that's not necessarily so, because in some sense it puts the United States in a much more advantageous position. That now they are going to have to, in other words, it's going to be a three-cornered negotiation, and the US is going to be in a way facilitating and, talking to all sides. So even if it's a plan B, from the American side, it's not such a bad plan B. But I think the question really will come on the intra-Afghan talks. With such a broad and deep political division after the elections, what happens to that 15-member broad-based, representative Afghan delegation? Will they sit together? I think the US would be counting on a public, desire and almost desperation for the peace talks to start. In fact, I think that has been
together.
Yes, that as well as I think the sheer clout that the US has with, virtually all political parties and forces in some way or the other dependent on the US. So I think they hope that they can bring their political clout as well as a kind of public pressure for talks to bear on that. And which is why you may not have seen, the call to take to the streets by the Abdullah Dostum camp, not having really been, not having crossed the brink. It seems as though all parties have had the maturity and also the restraint to hold back a bit.
So that's all posturing for their constituencies? We've seen what's happened with all these leaders.
I think everything is possible. We don't know what may be happening behind the scenes. There could well be, and I think
is
the
there
US,
a danger that
I think Special Envoy Khalilzad is playing a role, going and talking to all the parties. So I think there is clearly some space in which an attempt is being made to put the Humpty Dumpty of the intra-Afghan talks, back together.
But is there a danger that the intra-Afghan fallout politically could not only damage the structure within the country, but have a derailing effect for talks?
Yeah, you see, there are derailing effect of talks actually may come from something else. I mean, you could still go through the form of meeting together and initiating the talks, but actually the substantive differences between the two sides will still remain extremely difficult to bridge. And there was also always this question of consensus within the Republican side, and what compromises will you make? Everybody knows that you will have to make compromises. At the same time, the Republican side is very clear that they don't want to lose the gains of the last 18 years. Whatever the outcome, there's a feeling that perhaps the 2004 constitution will need to be amended, whether or not it goes towards an Islamic emirate or not. So I think the bigger issue really comes from the fact that there just does not seem to be adequate consensus within the Afghan side to be able to negotiate that kind of agreement. And so it will be messy. But perhaps the most important part is that the Afghan team will now be going into these negotiations much weaker than before. Why is that? Because until now, the US was still a strategic partner and was militarily and politically on the side of the Afghan government and the Republican Constitution. Now, during this process of the peace talks, the US has repositioned itself to now a facilitator in which the other parties are effectively, all at the same level. So that means militarily, there's a change in equation. The US is out of the equation, but there is no change in the Pakistani Taliban equation. And diplomatically, now you have, a lot more people around and behind the Taliban, and the government has lost support. So that's going to be another very tricky point. Now, Given that vulnerability, will that work in favor of a peace process, or will that actually weaken a peace process? That is to be seen.
One factor that could actually derail the whole process when you're talking about verification of reduction in violence are spoilers. You mentioned Pakistan, the Islamic State. Now, we saw early February when there was a firefight with somebody in Afghan uniform who killed 2 American soldiers. That didn't affect the process as such, and it's being portrayed as possibly either an insider or Islamic State itself. That's one danger you see?
Well, that danger has been talked about. There's been a lot of talk about division between the negotiators and some of the commanders, splits within the Taliban, some elements going across to the IS. But I think it means something that somebody like Sirajuddin Haqqani, who calls himself or is called the deputy leader of the Taliban, actually makes an opinion piece in an international periodical of the sort that he did. That means whatever it is, these differences are not going up to the top. So I think at this point, we should not work on the presumption that certainly there will always be spoilers, but how significant they will be, how much they are likely to be able to actually disrupt the peace talks. I would say that this test period of 1 week will show whether they have that degree of control. And my guess is that this opinion piece was probably important for that, because until now, we have not had a public statement by a Taliban leader of that level, that too in English, that has been available for the international community.
International community. Now, Secretary Pompeo again today has said we're closely watching what's happening in terms of the election results. The Russians have issued a warning statement. The only ones who congratulated him was Senator Lindsey Graham. Maybe wants to pressure somebody, including President Trump. After that, UNAMA took note of it. The EU congratulated him. India was quick to step in. Ambassador has met Amrullah Saleh as well. Kuwait then, and today Sri Lankan President Gautam. How do you read all that, and why has India made such a quick move?
Well, 2 points. I think there is something to be said for making a quick move if you are more or less clear about your position. I think the Indian position has had clarity in this respect. And the second is that, for India, it's been a very consistent support for the Afghan state and Afghan institutions. And to that extent, this is in keeping with our support for Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, Afghan-controlled peace process. It's been consistent with our support for the elections. And it's been consistent with our support for the institutions under the Constitution, including the Independent Election Commission. So it would be actually an awkward position for India to thereafter, disregard the announcement, which has taken 5 months and a lot of process to reach, to disregard the results of the elections.
Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, it's going to be a long and arduous road ahead for Afghanistan, as the world community also is involved. For over 40 years now, they've been going through this. Thanks for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you. My pleasure, Amitabh.